Welcome to the Business Trendsetter podcast, where we talk about trends and how to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
We are Spark Partners. We help companies to scale and grow. On today's podcast, we want to discuss a couple of very interesting topics. The first of which is God Save the Queen. All over the news has been reports and on the ground at the funeral. Of course, the longest reigning queen of England died last week. And it's kind of made me think about how maybe 100 years ago, or certainly 200 years ago, there was lots of reigning monarchs. There was lots of things happening in the world as it pertains to royalty and the way they kind of governed. And obviously over the past, at least since her reign, the whole idea of the monarch and how they actually operated has changed significantly. And certainly they're now basically a figurehead. So I wanted to get your thoughts, Adam, on the whole idea of the way that the monarchy and other similar institutions have fallen out of favor and are no longer a trend.
Okay. Well, first of all, they as we're recording this is the day of the Queen's burial, and I just heard a few minutes ago that over 4 billion people around the world observed this, and that clearly indicates that it was of great interest. And I think part of what's interesting about this to me is that I was shocked. I have to be really honest. I pay no attention to the monarchy of Britain at all. I have not tracked it. I haven't paid attention. To me, it's kind of like something on the National Enquirer, whether or not the Prince of Wales is going to be king, who he's married to, his son that met an American and gave up his royal title. All of this to me just seems like much ado about nothing. I pay no attention to it at all. But I want to point this out to our listeners, because people know I track a lot of trends. Between you and I, Manny, we track about 600 trends, and we keep, we're watching business and what's happening all the time, and trying to keep our eyes on popular culture as well, and because that influences how people behave in decision making. And it just goes to show that even somebody who spends a lot of time in it can miss something. And so business people need to be aware that it's important to have, friends. It's important to have colleagues. It's important to have advisors who are outside your scope, who are able to look around and look at things differently. So like today, Manny, when you asked me if I'd like to talk about the monarchy, I was just like surprised, because I was kind of like, wow, I hadn't even thought about it. I had no interest in watching the funeral. I didn't watch the funeral. Does that mean that I'm callous? I'm not sure that means I'm callous, but it definitely shows that there's some parts of the world for which even I am out of touch. And that can happen to all of us.
It can. So I get news on my phone, right?
Yeah.
And over the past number of days, the amount of news that has been coming through regarding the Queen and what's happening with the monarchy. Obviously, you mentioned 4 billion people have been observing some of those events. To me, it's also astounding, right, that we're getting big news sources just pumping out information about this. And like you said, it's much ado about nothing. It's not really, they don't have any real power. They actually cost their individual sovereign nations a lot of money. I forget the number of it, but it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Queen of England and all the pomp and circumstance would cost the taxpayers of England, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars per year. So people are like, abolish the monarchy. But to some, I guess it meant a lot.
Yeah, obviously. And so what it points out is that you need to know what's important to your business, and look beyond the operational elements of your business. Look at your customers and look at what's important to your customers. Clearly, I don't have any clients in the UK right now. And if I did, I'm sure I would be I would be dramatically embarrassed, because it would indicate a real inability on my part to see what's important to my clients. I don't have any in the UK right now, so I'm not feeling as embarrassed as I would if I was in that situation. But often we don't pay enough attention to our customers, to what's going on with our customers, and what is driving their decision-making process. What makes them happy, what makes them sad, where they feel like their needs are met and where they feel like their needs are unmet. There's clearly a set of needs around the world I mean around the world, because 4 billion people, we're way, way beyond the population of the United Kingdom here. 4 billion people around the world wanted to watch this. And remember, I think it started at 2:30 or something really, really early in the morning here in the United States. So you had to either stay up all night or get up very early if you wanted to watch it. But there were a lot of people who did. And they had to care, right? They had to care. There's a need, or they wouldn't watch it. And I can't put my finger on that need right now. I can't explain it, but I should. And I think it wakes me up to the notion of this is something I probably ought to spend a little time investigating. Again, if I had seen that, been listening on the National Public Radio, and I'd heard, vast throngs in the UK, or people coming to London from Wales and distant points, Scotland, I would have been like, okay, that all makes sense. If we lost a very high-ranking dignitary, it might happen in the United States. But this is 4 billion people around the world that cared enough to watch this funeral of the Queen of England. And so what that tells me is there's some kind of a need there, and a need that was being met by this queen, and how she what she did for a living, and how she interacted with people. And I want to try to get more attuned to that. I want to pay more attention. I want to listen and try to see if I can figure out, because now we have a new king. Yeah. And even though he's in his 70s, and he was born to be king, but we've been able to observe his military life and his civilian life,
personal life too.
Yeah, right. Now it's going to be. I think if I'm going to start watching that and see how people react to him as king, to see if it gives me some insight to what their needs are, because there was some kind of a need that was met by observing the Queen of England. If people don't get that need met by the king, we'll hear about it. If they do get their needs met by this new king, we'll hear about it. And I hope to get my hands on what those needs are, so I can have a better understanding, so that as we talk to people, especially people in consumer products, we'll kind of be able to connect up with what it is out there that people saw in the Queen of England that made them care so much.
There's a great program on Netflix. If you get a chance to watch it, it's called The Crown. Mm-hmm. And it's a biopic. It sort of talks about the early days before she was queen. And it's actually very, very well produced. And, we talk about Netflix all the time, but they really did a good job. The only reason that I really at any level care or are interested is because I watched that series. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Adam, I don't watch a lot of TV, or I don't watch hardly anything, just the occasional show. And this one I actually watched from start to finish. And so it's just interesting. And, one of the ideas in the show is that the monarchy, at least in the UK, is there to give hope and to give a sense of direction to the people that she reigned over. So it's kind of a hope thing. I mean, obviously it's a figurehead thing, but it sort of depicted Margaret Thatcher and the others that have obviously operated underneath her, how they actually went and kept her abreast of what was happening. And they remember that coal. I don't know if you remember that coal mining town in Scotland somewhere that kind of fell to pieces, and all these kids got killed a long time ago. Well, she actually flew in and came in and was a beacon of hope for those that were there. So,
yeah, I did. Mary Lou watched that, and she also watched. She's a big fan of Downton Abbey and the Downton Abbey movies. And so I've seen, I think, probably every episode of Downton Abbey, just because I happened to be in the room when it was on, because she watches them again and again and again. And I do recall that one of the things, if you watch the Downton Abbey series, is it takes you back to a time when business people were not well thought of. And it reminded me that if you took the days of Plato, when Plato was writing, and he came up with the perfect society in the Republic, and it took him 20 years to write it, and he described it as a pyramid, and at the top were philosopher kings, and at the very bottom of the pyramid were the merchants. There were 5 levels. The bottom level, I'm reminded, this is my college philosophy days, the bottom level were the merchants. And he said, give them all the money. They deserve it, because it's the most horrible thing in the world to have to be a businessman, using modern language. He thought that the people that went around just made markets and bought and sold things, he thought that would be a horrible, horrible life. And he didn't think much of it. And if you look at the Downton Abbey series, there's several times in there where there will be wealthy business people that are introduced to the Lord, the primary Lord of the show, and his entourage, and they frequently look down upon the business people. Kind of like, ooh, that's kind of like, that's. They're not born to lordship. They made their money in business. Kind of. They really took a askance eye at these business people. And I'm reminded how things change over time. Because there was a time in which you had a lord, he had a manor, he had all these servants. That's the whole Downton Abbey thing. People were caste, where you were born, you were more or less stuck. There was not much really to move around. And then these business people came in, started making lots of money. And even the lords of England didn't really think much of these folks. They're kind of like,
Right.
Kind of like that was almost like it's dirty money. It's, dirty money somehow. And, these people, they could act as if they could dress like a lord. They could behave like a lord, but they weren't a lord. And therefore,
Right.
there was a big difference. And, that was a different time. And now, we've kind of come, especially up through the 80s, where we've accelerated the view of business people, run government like a business.
Right.
That wasn't something people said in the 30s and 40s. Nobody talked about running government like a business. And the whole concept of business education exploded. There were very few MBAs. The concept of business education, as we've talked about, didn't start until 1905, And
Right.
the first business school at Harvard came along in 1912. We've only been at this 100 years, but we've gone from a world in which nobody got a business degree, and 100 years later, we're graduating nearly 500,000 MBAs a year.
Yeah.
So these are trends. They're trends. Right. And, I do get caught up in the trends that I watch a lot. Then, it could be that, here people are getting disdain for business people again. And perhaps what we see in the Queen and some reverence for a queen is something beyond business, something beyond making money, which is again where you and I focus this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually have an interesting segue to our next topic. Let's talk about the reigning dictator, if you will, of the American capitalist system, and that, of course, is the Fed.
Mm.
So you talked earlier about some thoughts on inflation and how the reigning dictator of the Fed is making some moves which may not be in coherence with the way that things ought to be. So I'm going to give you that one to stir around.
You reminded me, Robert Reich, who was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, wrote a book called Locked in the Cabinet. And he talks in there about going to have a meeting with the most powerful man in the world. And it was Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve. He didn't have much good to say for Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve. Now Robert Reich is a professed liberal, no doubt about that. He's a lawyer by training. And he's on the progressive end of the spectrum. But one of the things that's interesting, I think that, again, as a business people, we have to pay attention to outside influences on our business and what's happening. And you know that months ago, I believed that inflation would not be big. And simultaneously, I wasn't expecting a big jump in interest rates. And so my forecast at that time was that we should expect that inflation would get tamed and we would bring the supply chains back in order. Now, what did I miss? What I missed was that there are two dictators in the world, Xi Jinping in China and Putin in Russia, who control resources, dramatic amount of resources that are not only in their country, but have a big impact outside their country. So you have Putin, he manages we globalized, starting with the Reagan administration in particular, but I mean, I can go back even before that to Richard Nixon saying, we can't ignore 1 billion people in China and opening up our discussions with starting business in China with Nixon. Since then, we moved towards a globalization. We started to have more global trust. And in that process, we made some deals. And one of the deals was that we did an awful lot of manufacturing in China. And we would invent semiconductors, and we would invent memory chips, and we would invent circuitry. We'd often invent the equipment to make things like that. And then we would put the equipment in China or Taiwan, other foreign countries. But a lot of it went into China to do the manufacturing. And we did this to the extent that I'll never forget reading about how we were cutting down trees in South Carolina, putting them on a ship, sending them to China, where they were made into furniture to then put on a ship to come back to the United States. It seems kind of ridiculous, but in fact, there was enough wage variation that it made all that worthwhile. And
Yeah.
so, and at the same time, we saw this happen. We had increased the relationship with Russia. We had a lot of software engineers in Russia. A lot of people had divisions in Russia. And, the Europeans in particular had made deals with the Russians for energy. They were getting a lot of petroleum and a lot of natural gas. And it had turned Russia in a decade into a world-class petro economy, right? They
Yeah.
were selling all this. And so what was happening was there was this huge dependency on Russia and China. You and I knew this. It was the trend had been for globalization, and I think if anybody had been in one of my workshops for 10 years up before the pandemic, if we'd talk about globalization in terms of ever expanding globalization, people were moving around, people were spending more time in foreign countries. You were seeing foreign food. Indian food was becoming popular in the United States. You could get any kind of food you wanted in the United States. And the same was true around the world. I could go land in Australia and I could get food from practically any country. Restaurants were covering around. And just globalization was flourishing. What happened? Well, what happened was two dictators got control of their economies, and they didn't really like globalization the way we think of it.
Yeah.
They thought of it in a different way, and they're ready to, clamp the levers down. Russia's ready to attack Ukraine. I didn't see that coming. Most people didn't see that coming. Didn't expect that they would start to threaten to turn off the gas flow into Europe. Most people didn't see that Xi Jinping would start to shut down factories. He'd shut down whole cities. He'd take on a policy of pandemic, policy of wanting no cases, and therefore just make literally hundreds of millions of people stay home to the point of almost starving to death. And therefore, they couldn't go to work. And if they couldn't go to work, they couldn't get parts. And we ended up with a supply chain shortage. So bringing the supply chains back online has become a much more difficult problem than even I anticipated during the pandemic. I thought it would take longer than the government people did. They sort of anticipated 3 months. I thought it would take more like 9 months to 12, but it's taken even longer than that. So what happened? What happens is we get a world in which there's a shortage of parts, right? And because of shortage of parts, you can't go buy a new car. A friend of mine recently was telling me he had between he and his wife, they have 3 cars, and we were just sitting down having a cocktail one evening, and he said, "Yes, I sold my car. It happened to be a Jeep manufactured product." And he told me that he had bought it 3 years ago, and the dealer offered him the same price that he paid brand new. He offered to give that money back to him to turn over his 3-year-old Jeep because he could then sell it used for more than he had sold it to his friend brand new. Why?
There's a
Because
huge shortage. Yeah.
So these shortages have caused an enormous problem in terms of product and product supply, right? And that involves, again, the two big issues here are what's happening in China and what's happening with Russia, and our inability to do business with Russia, pulling resources out of Russia because they've undertaken to start a war in the Ukraine. So now then, what we do is we start saying, okay, people still want to buy stuff. So the same story, there's not enough parts. People still want to buy cars. People are still working, right? I mean, we did much better working through the pandemic than people estimated. As the pandemic has, reduced dramatically, people going back to work, we're at the lowest level of unemployment that we've seen in my lifetime. Again, this was very predictable because we follow demographic trends. And we knew that, there's an aging population. In the pandemic, we saw like the airlines come along and they'd say, "Oh my gosh, there's nobody flying. Let's go to the top to the pilots that are in our oldest pilots and just see if they wouldn't take a retirement. Let's push them out with a retirement." And they did. Then what happens? Pandemic starts to come to an end. People want to fly again, and we don't have any pilots. Why not? Because they retired out the old ones. There's no young pilots there. We've got a problem. We've got this lack of young people. So we're seeing that that's what's happening everywhere now. We've got some people that are older, people that are working, people have money, people are ready to spend money, but there's nobody to go to work. Minnesota has an unemployment rate of 1.9%.
Crazy.
Right now, if you want to buy a Pella window or an Anderson window, you're going to wait 30 weeks to get a window because there's no people in Minnesota at those window factories to go to work, and they can't get people to go there. I was in Wisconsin recently, and in Wisconsin, they have an unemployment rate. I think they're saying it's 2 point something percent, but the reality is that they have 30,000 people in Wisconsin that are on unemployment, and they have 129,000 job openings in the state. So there's 4 job openings for every person in the states to be unemployed.
Incredible.
Now,
Yeah.
if you had people over 62 said they wanted to reenter the job force, you could start to maybe rebalance that. But how many of those people want to go back and work in a factory again, making windows or doing things like that?
Right.
It's hard to pull them back in. So what we have happening is what's called cost push inflation. Right? Cost push inflation means that there's people out there working but there's not enough being made. And now that's where we are. That's not what happened in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve saw that its role was to help grow the economy. And they wanted to grow the economy on average at 3.5%. That was the stated goal. And it had come up from the 50s, 60s, 70s, grow the economy at 3.5%. They had turned to managing interest rates. And they thought if they could keep interest rates in the range of 3.5% to 5% for businesses, that was what was good. Now remember, at that time, there were all kinds of controls. There was something called Regulation Q. Reg Q meant that if you, Manny, or I went to any bank in the United States and opened what was called a passbook savings account, we were paid 5.25% by law. You couldn't be paid less. You couldn't be paid more. You were paid 5.25%. If you wanted to make a large deposit, you still got 5.25%. You could buy a certificate of deposit, and that was $10,000 plus, but even those were controlled by the Federal Reserve. So depending upon the size, 10,000 to 20, 20 to 30, up to $100,000, the interest rate that you were given was controlled. So there's all kinds of controls on interest rates. In trying to keep interest rates low, the Federal Reserve started printing more money. And then what happened was things got out of control. Making more money to keep interest rates low, but now you're producing so much money, and now you had things like we used to call cost of living adjustments, we called COLAs back in the day.
Yeah.
So unionized workers who at the time were 40% of the population, they're now less than 10% of the population, but the union workers had COLA adjustments, so they automatically got pay raises. So what was happening was you had this money flowing out, and it was creating so much money that people could buy all this stuff. And so the answer to that was Paul Volcker, who was brought in as Federal Reserve Chairman under Jimmy Carter. A lot of people get that wrong. Think it was wrong Reagan. It was Jimmy Carter who brought him in. And Volcker jacked up interest rates to 18%. What he did was he shrunk the money supply. He said, no, what we've done at the University of Chicago is we started to understand through the monetarist principles that you can't grow the money supply faster than you grow the economy. If you grow the money supply faster than the economy, it just produces inflation. It's funny money. It's fake money. And so what we have to do is reduce money supply growth to match the economy growth. And in doing that, causes, this horrible, run up inflation. Interest rates jumped to 18%. My first mortgage was 13.5% that I got in the early 80s. And that was how he broke the back of inflation. But that's not the problem today. These are two different situations. What's going on today isn't excess money in the money supply.
No.
And so what's happening is you got the Federal Reserve jacking up interest rates. So now then, what did I say? There's not enough people to work. There's not enough people going to jobs. So they're not making enough doors, not making enough windows, not making enough cars. They're not making enough of all this stuff, right? And so what does the Federal Reserve do? Jack up interest rates. Oh, great. So I'm a businessman, and I'm out here, and I got demand coming at me like crazy, right? I got this demand. People want to buy my stuff to improve their homes and that kind of thing. And then I'm sitting here saying, well, I can't hire enough workers. I can't hire enough workers. And so what do? Well, first thing I do is I raise pay. Okay, let me offer them $5 more per hour. What does that do? Puts more money in their pocket, increases demand. The second thing that I do is I say, okay, you know what? Let's automate this. Let's go buy some equipment. Instead of having a worker over here, I'm going to have a piece of machinery. But when I buy the equipment, I got to go borrow the money to buy the equipment. So now they jack up the interest rates. Before it was 1.5%. Now it's 5.5%. So now I say, wait a minute, hold back. I don't want to invest in equipment. I don't want to build a new plant. So here's all this demand coming at me. But while the demand is coming at me like crazy, the Federal Reserve's raising the interest rates, which puts a damper on me. I don't want to go build a plant if I'm going to have to pay 7% interest. I don't want to go buy equipment if I got to pay 6% interest on it. So in the middle of all this demand coming at me, when I ought to be investing in plant and equipment in order to try to grow get more productivity, get more stuff out the door, I got the Federal Reserve taking me the opposite direction. Yeah. Saying, oh, no, we don't want to give you money.
That's why I called them a dictator.
Yeah. It's the wrong medicine. It's the wrong medicine. Now, it doesn't surprise me that much for a couple of reasons. One, Jerome Powell's not even an economist. He's a lawyer. And he got this, I'm not quite sure how he got the job. I've read 3 or 4 different ways through the Wall Street Journal and other very reliable sources, kind of the road he took. but I'm still surprised he got the job. And number two, there's this old phrase that if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they'd still never reach a conclusion. And that's because it's a sort of considered an art form. It's considered an unclear it's science, and so consequently,
pseudoscience, huh?
Look at things differently, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that the Fed's all out of whack here. I mean, So do I think that we would, that all this interest rate climb, three-quarter points again and again? What is that going to do? It's going to throw us into a worldwide recession. If they keep it up, yeah, he'll break the back. He'll break the back of demand, because what will happen, interest rates get so high that nobody wants to do anything. First, housing, look what's happened to housing. Sales of new homes plummeted to nothing. Sales of used homes have plummeted. Why? Because mortgage rates have gone from 3% to 6.5% in 9 months.
Yeah.
So now your payment, your monthly PITI has gone out of control. You can't afford to buy a house anymore. Is that the right answer? Is that the way to fix this problem? Of course not. What we need is more productivity. To get more productivity, you need more automation, and that means investment. And we should be doing everything we can to put money into investment. And the way to do that is lower interest rates. Instead, we're creating higher interest rates. I think the risk right now in everybody's scenario out there is they need to be the scenario risk that you really need to take into account is a big global recession. And I mean a big global recession, because the U.S. is raising its interest rates, the European Union is raising its interest rates, Australia is raising their interest rates. Everybody's saying, okay, we got global inflation, which once again back to why Larry Summers is the shit of the world, is because as an economist, he wants to take credit for predicting inflation. Well, I'm sorry, the U.S. economy and handing out money to people during the pandemic did not cause runaway inflation in the UK, France, Germany, Australia. It did not cause that to happen. Larry Summers did not know what he was talking about, and he doesn't know what he's talking about today. So what we need to do is we need to sit down and say, will the Federal Reserve make it possible for business people to welcome investment? To do that, business people say, the demand is coming at me big, and it will continue to come. If you got a bunch of demand coming at you and you think, it's going to crash in 6 months because people are going to run out of money or people can't borrow, you're not going to invest. So right now in this current economy, business people don't want to make investments in property, plant, and equipment. So they're not improving productivity. If we don't improve productivity, we're never going to get the stuff made for the people who want to buy it. So now we're going to keep having this cost push inflation, right? It's going to keep going up. I'm going to keep saying, there's only so many chips being made that for only so many cars. Therefore, instead of paying $40,000 for a car, I'm going to pay $100,000 for a car.
Well, what's crazy is just the timing.
But I think we have to be aware that within a year you could see a massive global recession, and that will break the back of inflation. People will quit buying because people will be out of work.
Out of work, out of money.
Yeah. Now, I don't think it'll hit us as hard. I mean, again, we're sitting here in this world in which you talk about, let's choke the economy. Jerome Powell's trying to choke the economy back. How much can you choke an economy like Minnesota, where unemployment's 1.9%?
No, it's crazy.
Yeah,
so what gets me about this, the chip stuff happening, they had this CHIPS Act that's looking at spurring new investment into the microchip world. They're building a couple new plants in the Phoenix area, and they want to bring some of this back home. Obviously, the looming threat of China invading Taiwan is all in the mix. But what they don't understand is in this whole framework, it's going to take a long time to get this fab up and running. We're talking about years and years and years. So it's almost like the decision makers are like 3 years behind in making these decisions. Or they're just making these wacko decisions, like you said, and of trying to choke the economy when we really should be paving the way for more productivity.
Well, you're right. And the reality was during the Trump administration, the change in the tax law did a lot to favor things like stock buybacks. It did a lot to favor privately held companies, people keeping the money. Because the incentive was to put the money in your pocket due to lower taxes. So, if you want to create incentive in the economy, what you do is you say, if you make too much money, then I'm going to tax you. So what I'll do is I want to tax you high. That way, instead of putting the money in your pocket, spending the money, what you do is you say, I'm going to go spend the money on investment, because then I can deduct it. Then I don't pay it in taxes. So I have a choice. Imagine the business person who says, I have a choice. I can pay the money in taxes, or I can put the money into a new piece of equipment. Let's go put in a piece of equipment. That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's not what the tax act that happened at the very beginning of the Trump administration. That's not what it did. It did the opposite. Instead of saying, okay, here's great breaks if you make investments, but if you don't make investments, we're going to tax you. It did the opposite. And it said, hey, we're not going to tax you at these high rates. So consequently, put the money in your pocket. Doing that meant that people in private equity firms, all the people that played in the money game, they all just started putting the money in their pockets, getting more wealthy. People that the corporation said, hey, there's no reason for me to go invest in a new plant. I'll just, I'll buy stock. So it's billions and billions and billions of dollars buying their stock back because there was no incentive not to. It was a better way, put the money in the shareholder's pocket. So that's what went wrong in the last administration, was that the investments were planned poorly. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, didn't know what he was talking about when he was putting the tax together. None of these people really thought through what's good for the economy. Instead, they were driven by an ideology, right? An Ayn Rand ideology. So now what we have is, you're right, we're late to the game. But again, we're still not doing enough to help push investment, right? So we're saying we're going to give some money. Now, I do think, again, I think the downside risk is this global recession. But on the other side, I'd say as a business person, it's also a good time to be making investments, because if that big downside doesn't happen and you take some risk and you invest today, you're investing because unemployment is low. Unemployment's going to remain low because there aren't any people. It's tough to get immigration approved, even in this world where we've got Ukrainians and Poland and all kinds of people we could be, bringing into the society and uses immigration to solve this labor problem. Instead, we have governors of Florida and Texas putting people on airplanes, flying them to New York as political stunts. They're not addressing the immigration and how could we use immigration as a tool for growing the economy. Instead, they're just hyping fears and doing very strange things. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, spent $16,000 per person to take immigrants that were in Texas and fly them to Martha's Vineyard. They weren't even in Florida, right? So it just kind of tell you how bizarre the whole thing is. It doesn't have anything to do with the economy. It doesn't have anything to do with growing the economy. These are political stunts, fear-mongering. We need to drive investment, and we're going to need more people to man the equipment, and that means we're going to need more immigration. So we need policies that encourage investment and that encourage immigration. We're partway there with the CHIPS Act. We're partway there with the Inflation Reduction Act. We're partway there with the Infrastructure Act. But those, as you said, hey, it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years for those to play out. Yeah. And as they play out, there's no real guide in there to say, make it productivity investment instead of hiring. And so now what happens is we got to change the tax code. You got to come back again to saying, okay, and they did a little bit of it. They're going to tax some stock buybacks. That's a little bit. That makes it a little difference on the margin. But we need to be doing a lot more. But if you look back where we were in the 50s and 60s, there was very, very high incentives to reinvest. If you invested in R&D, you got a $2 tax deduction for every dollar you put in R&D. Every dollar you put in property, plant, and equipment, you could depreciate out. And therefore, you had high tax rates, but people didn't pay high tax rates. Companies didn't pay high tax rates because they kept investing. And they invested in the economy. And that was the big boom of the 50s and 60s. And that's what we have to get back to. You got to invest.
Exactly.
So I would say everybody needs to have their eyes wide open. Be aware that the Federal Reserve is acting like an idiot right now. They're doing the wrong things. And realize that we need more fiscal policy. We need to head down this road, get more investment. We probably need to change the tax code. But I would still say keep your eyes wide open for the potential big lose, which is the global recession. But if you're optimistic at all, then I would say it's a great time to invest in productivity, because we're never, I see nothing that says we're going to be able to supply this needed demand unless we get more investment in equipment and improve productivity.
Very well said, Adam. And certainly to our listeners and our viewers, this should be something you should pay attention to. Things are in motion. Take a look at the trends. If you are listening to our podcast on a regular basis, you know that we have a course called Think Innovation, which gives you the tools to be able to actually look for yourself and what you can do in your business today to be ready for what's happening tomorrow. With that, Adam, have a wonderful rest of the week, and we'll be talking to you next week.
Thanks, Manny.
Cheers.